The last nuclear weapons treaty between Russia and the United States has expired. UN Secretary-General António Guterres says its end marks a grave moment for international peace and security. So, how worried should we be? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, was signed between Russia and the US in 2010, and it was aimed at preventing a catastrophic nuclear war. Now, for the first time in more than half a century, there will be no legal limits on American and Russian warheads. The upshot is, we all now live in a world without nuclear arms control.
Startling headlines flood the American press following news of the atom explosion within the borders of the Soviet Union.
The Cold War is best known for the nuclear arms race between America and Russia, coming to a head during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But starting in the 1970s, Moscow and Washington agreed on treaties that limited the number of deployed nuclear warheads, putting the potential destruction that they could cause above their geopolitical rivalry. In 2010, then-Presidents Obama and Medvedev signed the New START Arms Control Treaty, but that has now expired. And President Trump has rejected a Russian offer to extend it.
The president wants to have our nuclear experts work on a new, improved, and modernized treaty that can last long into the future, and that's what the United States will continue to discuss with the Russians.
And it's not just the Russians that the US wants to make a new nuclear deal with. Trump is insisting that China be involved in any new treaty. Russia and America still possess the overwhelming majority of warheads, but China has around 600 stored missiles, with that number growing rapidly. France and Britain have less than China combined, with over 500 between them. India, Pakistan, Israel and North Korea also have significant stockpiles. Every year since 1947, atomic scientists have set the doomsday clock to measure the risk of global nuclear disaster. And in January this year, they set it closer to midnight than ever before. They cited aggressive behaviour by Russia, China and the United States, ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, and crucially, fraying nuclear arms control. The last legal safeguard restricting the number of weapons like these has now lapsed. The world has returned to the great power politics of the past, and with no nuclear treaty now in effect, the risks of that era have returned too.
Well, let's meet our guests for this one. Joining us from Basel in Switzerland, we have Xiaodan Liang. He is a senior nuclear weapons policy and disarmament analyst at the Arms Control Association. In Washington, D.C., in the United States, Frank Rose. He's Principal Deputy Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration in the Biden administration. And joining us from Vienna in Austria, we have Nikolai Sokov. He's Senior Fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and a former Russian arms control negotiator. Gentlemen, you're all very welcome to Roundtable. Frank, to you, first of all, I just want to start off with your sense of how dangerous a world we're living in now because this treaty is gone.
Well, let me say a couple of things. One, I supported New START when it was negotiated. Furthermore, I supported the extension back in 2021. But New START ran into a couple of challenges, both technical and strategic. At the technical level, the inspection stopped in 2020 because of COVID. And in 2023, Putin, in response to U.S. support for Ukraine, cut off all the data exchanges. So the treaty really had not been working for the past 3 years. The central limits remained, but the data exchanges, the on-site inspections stopped. Secondly, at the strategic level, New START was designed to regulate bilateral U.S.-Russia nuclear competition in a relatively benign environment. That's not the environment we are in today. What we have seen over the past several years has been a buildup of Chinese nuclear forces. From around 200 in 2016, China today has about 600 weapons, and the US intelligence community assesses by 2030 they will have over 1,000. So I think we're in a fundamentally different strategic environment, and we need a new arms control framework to deal with that environment.
Nikolai, I can see you nodding in agreement there to some of what Frank was saying. Do you think that's what needed, that China needs to be brought into this conversation very quickly?
Well, yes, certainly the strategic environment has changed. Yes, it's not actually limited to the Chinese buildup, because although, yes, Chinese buildup is one sort of important oh, elements. Yes, it would be very desirable to bring China in, but we also perhaps need to keep in mind that considering the desire for the European nuclear deterrence that we now see in the European Union, in Europe in general, the British and the French actual nuclear forces will likely be diversified and built up too. So we do actually see plenty of movement in all the five official nuclear powers.
Thank you, Nikolai. Xiaodan, to you, does China want to be part of this conversation in terms of joining a trilateral treaty?
So historically, China has been very averse to joining nuclear arms control. Their position has been that the US and Russia have a responsibility to draw down their forces first before China will participate. And now, as Frank mentioned, as China builds up to 1,000 of operational warheads, I think other countries should be asking questions about whether that policy still makes sense and to put pressure on China. Now, whether they will actually be open to speaking on this issue when Trump visits Beijing in April really depends on what package the United States can bring to the table to engage them and whether it can be something attractive and how important this issue will be on the bilateral agenda.
And Xiaodan, were you surprised that this treaty was allowed to run down? I mean, everyone knew the end was coming. Are you in some way shocked?
Well, not exactly shocked, but it was a little bit disappointing because previously, during the Biden administration, the Russian position was that they were not going to negotiate on a follow-on treaty until the U.S. position on Ukraine had shifted, essentially. When at that time the Biden administration was open to negotiations, and then under the Trump administration's first year, this sort of flipped. The Russians were more open to negotiations, and the Trump administration dragged its feet. So this is disappointing because it's been a waste of valuable time until the treaty runs down. And as you mentioned, the treaty was going to end no matter what. So the tragedy is that there are no ongoing serious talks.
Frank, to you, President Trump says this was a badly negotiated treaty. I'm presuming he said that because he didn't negotiate it.
Well, I don't think it was a badly negotiated treaty. What I would say is it reflected the strategic environment of the time it was negotiated. What I would say, furthermore, is that we're in a new strategic environment. So we need a new treaty structure to deal with the strategic effects that we are dealing with. So it wasn't a bad treaty for the time it was negotiated, but I would say the strategic environment has outrun it.
Thank you, Frank. Nikolai, to you, President Putin did offer the Americans an extension and nobody followed up. They just let it roll.
Yes. Well, just let me first actually address the previous question quickly. I think that New START was a good treaty with very limited mission. So essentially, it was a temporary fix for the problem of strategic transparency and predictability. While the two parties were supposed to negotiate a more comprehensive treaty, it was very limited, in fact. Is unfortunately, new negotiations did not even begin. So now we do is actually faced an urgent need in negotiating a new treaty. So that's kind of the situation right now. Yes, Putin did propose that the two parties abided informally to the numerical limits of New START. Yes, Donald Trump did not agree, is I think primarily because he does look at the possibility of building up strategic forces of the United States is in response to China. Yes, quite obviously, actually, when Russia sees that, it might actually start to build up too. Yes, I already mentioned that Great Britain and France will likely build up. So the biggest challenge is of the expiration of New START is the fact that the strategic environment will no longer be regulated. Yes, and that's will really kind of serious in the sense that everyone will be doing their own thing based on the worst case assumptions. That does actually send us back to the 50s, which was definitely not the safest time in human history, to put it very mildly.
Thank you, Nikolai. Xiaodan, the treaty ending, what does it mean for conflict at the moment, say in Ukraine, coming up to the 4-year anniversary very shortly? Does this have an impact on what Russia can or cannot do?
I mean, with regards to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, this is rather separate. I don't think that there needs to be here any connection at all, and I don't think it is appropriate for countries to be seeking to link the two. Now, there has been some reporting that within Washington, there are some of the president's advisors seeking to link the two, to wrap the new treaty proposal into the end of end to the negotiated end to the Ukrainian conflict. I think this is a very unfortunate strategic approach, and there does not necessarily need to be any connection between the two at all.
Thank you. Frank, just come in on that then. How seriously do you think Trump takes the whole nuclear issue? Because he hasn't really kind of got that involved previously, and yet he does seem to be hinting that resuming nuclear testing might be on his radar.
Well, I would say he actually does take the nuclear issue very seriously. His uncle, John J. Trump, was a physicist or nuclear engineer at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I think he really sees himself as a deal maker. I think in his first term, he was really focused on the issue of North Korea in bringing China into the mix. So we will see, but I would not, dismiss his interest in getting a deal. The question is, can he put the pieces in place to make a deal happen with China? And I think there are a lot of questions there.
Do you think he can, Frank? Do you think he can get a deal over the line with President Xi?
We will see. But at the end of the day, in my view, China will come to the nuclear arms control table when they believe it's in their interest to do it. Fundamentally, what I think will bring them to the table is a buildup of U.S. military forces in East Asia that holds at risk things that are dear to China, very similar to the 1980s. The Soviet Union came to the table on intermediate nuclear forces, that treaty, when the United States and NATO deployed intermediate nuclear forces that could hold at risk targets in the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Frank. Nikolai, to you, I want to explore what kind of message this treaty's ending sends to other countries with nuclear ambitions. Countries like Iran, for example. What kind of message does this send to leaders?
Well, first of all, we will probably see, most likely we'll see the consequences of the expiration of New START during the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that will happen is in New York in the end of April and in May. And non-nuclear states have been extremely actually critical of nuclear states for not living up to the obligation uh, to seek the elimination of nuclear weapons. So that's going to be well, very serious. It's actually damage, political damage to all nuclear states, and first and foremost to the United States and Russia. So that's point number one. Point number two, when we see an unregulated security environment, including but not limited to nuclear weapons, yes, there will be more states probably thinking about nuclear weapons. I would not actually think that Iran is number one candidate right now, just considering the state is of Iranian military, its economy, and politics. But we do tend to forget about what you might call the friendly proliferation. Countries like South Korea, for example, that is very seriously actually looking at the nuclear program and considering sort of the security environment in which South Korea finds itself. We talk North Korea, we talk China, we just talk the generally much more fluid and unpredictable environment. Uh, yes, I would say that eventually, it's not going to happen right away, but eventually there will be more countries in the world looking at nuclear weapons, yes, and not only countries that we consider hostile, but also uh, uh, there are some countries that we consider friendly. Uh, the proliferation is proliferation. It's actually bad no matter who pursues it.
Thank you, Nikolai. Zhao, to you, as Nikolai was saying, it is a very unstable world right now. The end of this treaty probably couldn't have come at a worse time given some of the global conflicts we're seeing.
Yes, that's true. Although you also have to consider that maybe the lack of negotiations right now is also influenced by this the same trends. One thing that the two sides, the U.S. and Russia, could do is to take up Putin's offer, and there's been reporting that some negotiations did happen in Abu Dhabi to this extent, and extend the treaty informally for a year, perhaps 6 months or a year, and then revisit where the two sides stand after that. I think that would give the President Trump, I should say, some room to negotiate as he sees fit. It would not necessarily harm U.S. national security, although over time, the lack of inspections and verification of Russian forces would decay U.S. knowledge of those forces. So that would be a good starting place to recover some of that security.
And Zhao, give us your reading of the treaty. Was it respected by both sides? Do you genuinely think they stuck to the numbers they were meant to be at?
Yeah, so as Frank mentioned, Russia suspended its implementation of the treaty in February 2023, which was very unfortunate. However, at the time, what Russia stopped was, it did not resume negotiations on inspections, which had stopped at the beginning of the COVID epidemic, and it stopped data exchanges. However, it did hold to the central limits. And last year, at the beginning of last year, actually, the State Department, the US State Department, reported that Russian forces were more or less at about the limit. So that, to the best of US knowledge, that's where they were. So it seems that they held to the central limits of the treaty. And as far as we know, the United States did too.
Thank you. Frank, talk to me about the British and the French, two nuclear powers. Where did they come into this conversation? Would they be part of any new agreement?
Well, what I would say is British and French nuclear forces are very much smaller than the Chinese. I think they have around 200 warheads apiece. This has been a point for the Russians for many years, though the British and the French have been very reluctant to be brought into an arms control framework. My view is this: you start with the three biggest players, that is the US, Russia, and China. And once you get agreement there, perhaps you bring in Britain, France, India, and Pakistan. But right now, I think the big strategic issue is that trilateral group of countries: US, Russia, and China. Britain and France are not in that league.
Thanks, Frank. Nikolai, who needs to make some move here towards getting the treaty negotiations restarted? Who do you think will give ground first, Putin or Trump?
Well, actually, both countries, the United States and Russia, needs to make the first move, because the first move should, in fact, be, in my view, to actually begin talking, to get delegations somewhere. Most likely is Abu Dhabi, because the Russians no longer actually want to negotiate in Geneva, and just get them sit down for extended period of time. It's meeting every day privately behind closed doors, and finally understand the drivers and the motivations of, of, behind each country's position. One thing that we kind of have not done for a very long time is actually to have this very sustained interaction at the level of experts. We mostly look at ministerials, is at summits, but summits and ministerials do not really do actually much in terms of getting the deal, on the table. Summit will be good to announce that negotiations will be starting, but you definitely need actually people sitting there, yes, and working very quietly, but at the same time, potentially much more productively. We had two short-lived attempts to that kind of negotiations. Yes, and one is actually was like in the fall of 2020. It was still during the first presidential term of Donald Trump. Yes, and the second was like in the end of 21. Yes, and both times we did achieve some movement, but these were very short-lived attempts. We need to spend at least several months actually uh, between delegations kind of talking, yes, and trying to understand what's going on. My actually suggestion would be to start, in fact, bilaterally, so that both parties, both key nuclear states, started kind of to better understand each other. Well, because it's not just about nuclear weapons. Yes, it's also about missile defense. It's about uh, uh, conventional weapons and space weapons. Oh, so the agenda is actually very, very big. Yes, and
Thanks,
then
Nikolai.
they can actually figure out how to bring in all other nuclear states. Just wanted to note, however, that the Russians, yes, and China too, actually say that uh, the future negotiations can be either bilateral or include mm, all five parties. So I don't really think that this time Great Britain and France will actually be able to get off. At least their refusal to do so will likely actually block negotiations for at least a few years. Uh,
Thanks,
and
Nikolai. I want
perhaps
to go to Zhao Dan. Zhao Dan, just tell me what's happening now with the two major countries, the United States and Russia. Are they now building up because they're free of the shackles of this treaty, or do you think they will just take a pause and see what the other is doing?
So I think the Russian position has been that they will observe what the United States does and possibly reciprocate. The United States has the option to increase the number of warheads on its existing missiles rather quickly. And there are some who have called for an increase in the number of deployed warheads on US forces. And this could be done potentially, in within a year or a little bit more than that. It's not entirely clear. And the debate is in Washington about whether this would make sense to match China's nuclear buildup. Um, Beyond that, the United States has some bottlenecks about what it can do to further expand its nuclear forces. It could restore the nuclear capability of some bombers and to open up missile tubes on some of its strategic submarines. Uh, but the first few steps do not cost too much money, but after that, it does become more expensive.
Frank, just paint us a picture of what it was like to be in the room with President Biden when you were advising him on nuclear issues. You've worked at the highest level, at a hugely stressful position. How much responsibility did you bear each day going into that office and sitting your president down to tell him what's what?
Well, I didn't get a chance to talk to the president on a daily basis, but what I would say is the world is much more complicated than it was when New START was negotiated. And in addition to the strategic nuclear weapons that have been mentioned, there's a whole category of nuclear weapons, non strategic nuclear weapons, that are not constrained by New START. And the Russians, for example, have been expanding and modernizing those capabilities. And on top of that, there are cyber weapons, space capabilities, artificial intelligence that's really complicating the nuclear discussion. So, we going forward cannot just think of nuclear weapons as siloed in their own world. They are integrated with all of these other new and emerging capabilities.
Frank Rose in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. Nikolai and Zhao Dan as well. Fascinating stuff, gentlemen. Thank you. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit like and subscribe. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, we'll see you soon.